Yes, hello, what's happening, people? Welcome back. George here once again on the Kilohearts channel with what I hope will be a nice, interesting little video about building guitar stompbox style effects in Snap Heap. We're going to deal with this guitar sound today. We'll talk a little bit about what I've done and why I've done it. If we turn off this instance of Snap Heap, it sounds incredibly simple and flat. And if we hear that sound in the mix, it's not only a bit boring, but it's also indistinct. It doesn't live in its own space. So I'm trying to do two things with this stomp box, quote unquote. I'm trying to give the sound some character, make it interesting, but I'm also trying to give it its own pocket of space to live in the mix. And for me, that means limiting the sound, filtering the sound in three different dimensions. I don't mean literally the effects filter and limiter, although I've used a couple of filters here, but I mean limiting in the sense of sculpting out the stuff that we don't want in three different dimensions so that we give the sound a little pocket to live in. And those three dimensions, in my view at least, are frequency, up and down, so the low and high frequencies, let's think of that vertically, stereo image, left to right, of course, and the third dimension being sort of dynamics, closeness. How in your face is the sound? And I sort of think of that as in and out of the screen, further away or closer towards you. And obviously that has to do with volume and dynamics, but it also has to do with time-based ambience effects like reverb and delay. If you can sit a sound back in the mix by smothering it in reverb, and those kinds of things. So those three dimensions I'm trying to approach, as well as just making the sound a bit more interesting. So let's talk it over. On the left-hand side, we've got a pair of parallel buses. One of them is just taking the dry signal through unaffected, for reasons which we'll come on to. The other is copying the sound and filtering it nice and heavily. So we've got a low-pass filter with a nice resonant peak, and that peak is being moved around by the incoming amplitude information of the signal in our delightful auto-wah fashion, and then a nice harsh high-cut filter to clean up the low end. So we're building some movement, some interest into the sound purely in the modulation of those frequencies. And then we're blending some of the clean signal back in so that we can decide what we want in terms of transients and that broader band frequency information. So we have a gain control. We can have less or more of the dry signal. So that way we've controlled not only the center of the sound of the frequency spectrum, we've given it some movement and interest, but we've also controlled the highs and lows by deciding how much of those we want to blend back in. Next up, a serial bus. We feed straight into ensemble, and this is where a lot of the character of this sound comes from, I think. If we just listen a couple of times with and without the ensemble. That kind of rotating voices situation gives obviously a lot of motion and dimension to the sound, but it also adds some stereo width. So we're adding character and vibe with that detuning and that duplication of voices, but we're also sculpting the stereo image, the left-right dimension in our sound. Next up, some distortion. And especially with this filter peak moving things around, the distortion becomes a very interesting way to add character because certain frequencies will crack up in different ways. And I've added a macro to this sound to add drive at the expense of dynamics, which will really accentuate this element of the character of the sound. And you can really hear that filter peak at that point because it's providing some imbalance. So now we've got a nice characterful sound which has a lot more stereo width and a lot less frequency information. So we're sculpting the shape of the sound in those three dimensions. Let's now deal with some dynamics, some back and forth, some in and out. Let's bring it into our face and control how much of the sound disappears into the distance. So on our last bus, I have an instance of multipass in which basically two important things are happening. I'm compressing the middle frequencies. pretty heavily so that that main central body of the sound in terms of frequency is always going to feel present, no matter how quiet or loud it is. That really brings the sound up into the listener's face while smoothing out the errant peaks, which will make it stick out in an unpleasant way. I've also muted the low frequencies here, so there's a nice gentle roll-off of anything below the frequency range that we're interested in. And then I've added a reverb just to the high frequencies so that we get some of those more kind of percussive edges of the sound receding into the background and taking on a certain ambience without the middle frequencies being too muddy. It's neat that you can just load up multipass within a Snap Heap patch, do some multiband processing. By the way, this preset is available to download in the description if you want to go and check it out. And bear in mind, Snap Heap is completely free, so even if you don't own any Kilohearts products at all, you can take this and try it out in your DAW of choice. You won't be able to tweak the individual plugin parameters, but you will be able to use the macros to tweak the sound to your taste. So that's just our little gift to you today. You can take this stompbox away with you. Maybe use it on some drums or some vocals or something, who knows? Finally, I'm using Transient Shaper to bring some attack back into the sound. Now that I've contained the dynamics of the mid-range really harshly in multipass with that compressor, I'm just bringing back a little bit of bite with the Transient Shaper, but within a very controlled set of parameters, because I don't want this sound to jump out too much. So while adding interest and character to the sound, I hope that I have limited its frequency content to the middle. I have made it wider in stereo image with this ensemble plugin, and I've tightened up the dynamics quite considerably with a harsh compressor on the mid-range and that reverb setting the higher frequencies into the background a touch, so that we not only make the sound more interesting, but we give it its own little pocket to live in the mix. And let's listen once again before and after in the mix. So our stomp box is off. It's flat, it's amateurish, it's nothing. Yeah, now it's much more interesting, and it's also much more mix ready. It really sticks out and takes up its own space without obscuring other elements. And with automation, you can literally click that on and off just like you would a stompbox on stage. And that's what I really love about this. You can build a nice complex thing within Snap Heap with multi-band processing, with interesting characterful effects, and then you can just fold it down into a one on-off piece of on-stageable equipment. Not bad, right? Download the patch and try it for yourself. And don't forget, while you're at it, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you again next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.